And welcome to the Passenger Seat Podcast, a podcast designed to fill your passenger seat with chat about classic cars, all recorded from my 1968 Morris Minor Peggy. I'm Becca and today I'm on my way to work. Just a regular commute trip for Peggy again today. My quirk of classic car ownership for you today is that often we overlook the most simple and easy answers, and that comes for kind of potentially when we're looking for an issue with our cars that we think is causing them problems, but also in my case when it's come to recording this podcast. We're now 12 episodes into series 2, so nearly 32 episodes in, and I've not actually shown you round Peggy and pointed out some of her slightly unusual features and things like that. So I figured that would be a good start for today's podcast. So we're going to start internally today with kind of some of the things that are a bit unusual about Peggy, or also some of the things that are kind of my favourite things about Peggy actually. Obviously I love how she looks outside, but in terms of the inside, that's where I spend the majority of my time. That's where I see her from the most. So actually the internals is pretty important to me. So one of the things that kind of appealed to me when I was buying her was the fact that she has a radio quite discreetly fitted. It's a modern radio and it's hidden in the glove box, and it's got a little aerial that attaches to the windscreen over near kind of where the camera is actually, and that's pretty discreet. You can't really see that it's there apart from the little bit on the window, and again a kind of thing that's pretty easily reversible if somebody decided that they didn't like it. It's not kind of made a big mess of anything here. It does mean that I'm kind of missing the glove box there, but I kind of cope pretty well without it. And the only other thing that's kind of a little bit unusual about it is because it's attached to the windscreen, you can't really use the windscreen wipers when it's going, because it affects, because the windscreen wipers are metal, it seems to affect the signal a little bit. But to be honest, most of the time I'm listening to my own music via Bluetooth and stuff like that, rather than the radio in here. So that works perfectly fine, and it definitely makes kind of longer journeys and things in her much more enjoyable. The other thing that was kind of pointed out to us when we were buying her is the seats on the carpet of all her original interior. They've never been changed, and based on all of the kind of paperwork and stuff that we've got with her, we can pretty much confirm that that is indeed the case. It does mean that the front seats in particular are a little bit worn and tatty, but as I think you've probably seen in other videos, I've actually got some seat covers made for them, so that when we're kind of sat in here in summer, they serve the function of meaning that we don't get quite so hot sat on the seats, because they're made of towel, but also serve the function of tidying up probably the least tidy feature of her inside, which is the kind of slightly messy seats. But I don't feel the need to kind of replace them or do them up or anything, because they're perfectly comfortable, and I'm pretty happy with them. And also I like the seat covers and the kind of uniqueness that they add to the interior, and that they kind of fit with the theme that I've got in here. Additionally, because the carpets are original, they are a little bit worn in places, but I just bought some kind of red regular car floor mats, and have fitted those in kind of all of the footwells, and that again has really also tied in the inside a little bit more together, but just protects those original carpets. like I said, I've gone for a little bit of a theme in here, and that is to do with Peggy's namesake. For those of you that don't know, Peggy is named after Peggy Carter from the Marvel universe. She's a 1940s kind of SSR agent, and one of the very first things I did when I got Peggy was kind of where the tax disc should be, put a little SSR, which is a fictional kind of agency, sticker over there in where kind of the tax disc would be, and from there I've kind of added little bits and pieces. The seat covers are kind of Captain America themed, which fits with the kind of stories that Peggy Carter was involved in. And then I've got kind of some Lego figures and bobbleheads that have come more recently at the front here. We've got down the bottom some badges that I've kind of cut the pin backs off of and magnetised to my heater, which works quite well, and again it's added a little bit of something interesting. It's always nice when I go to shows for little kids to like point through and spot some of the kind of Captain America stuff if they recognise it, but it's also just a kind of point of intrigue for me, and it's really satisfying to see the bobblehead going. In the back, one of the first kind of little knick-knacky bits that I added was a bear that's got kind of Peggy Carter's red jacket and blue jacket and red hat on, which sits on the back shelf. I've also more recently added some crochet dolls of some of the other kind of outfits that she wears that sit on the back seat, and obviously we've got the name sticker in the back window as well. So those are all kind of little bits and pieces that I've added there in terms of theming the car around her name, which is quite enjoyable, and it also helps me explain to some people why she's called Peggy. Another thing interior wise that I'm particularly proud of is Peggy's picnic blanket. Being an ex-Girl Guide, I had a camp blanket which had badges and stuff from places that I'd camped and things, so I decided that I'd quite like to start a blanket with all of the places that I'd taken Peggy to, with a little patch on it as well. I've mentioned it before on the podcast, but I'll be sure to include some footage of it as well for you if you're watching on the YouTube channel. But it's a nice little addition. It sits on the back seats, and has a use for when we go picnicking and stuff. In terms of kind of in front of me, the most obvious difference is Peggy's steering wheel. The red steering wheel is a pretty recent addition, all things considered. It's something that I've been thinking about for ages, but hadn't actually had the opportunity to really do, and I wasn't sure exactly how possible it was going to be to get a steering wheel that the red paint and things would stick to. But when I found a steering wheel at Thoresby Hall for a £5, I figured it was worth a go. I didn't do it myself. I figured I'd give the steering wheel the best chance it had at surviving, so I had a friend of mine who does kind of paintwork and stuff previously to have a go at it. It's turned out really well. I'm really pleased with it. It also feels really smooth. There are a few kind of nips and things in the paint now, but I've just got myself a little touch-up pen because he told me the colour that it was that he used, so it's reasonably well holding together, to be honest, and it's always a point of interest for people to talk about at shows and things like that. One of the first things actually that I struggled with interior wise was the rear view mirror, and at the time my parents didn't have kind of a car of this period on the road or anything, so my dad rooted around in his garage and managed to find an extended rear view mirror that he used to use in his Hillman Imps. And so gave that to me to use, and it basically gives me the whole view of the back window. So really useful period accessory there that adds a little bit to my rear view. Also, interior wise, something that I always forget to mention is my handbrake cover. I meant to mention it in a podcast a while back about how to make your car more usable when it's hot and things like that, because it's a little adaptation that I made actually during the summer, when I noticed that the metal handbrake would get really hot from the heater and stuff in the summer, and it'd be quite hot to touch. So I actually kind of looked around for a little rubber grip that looked like it would fit, and managed to find for like a £5 or something on eBay a Riley Elf rubber hand grip. And it took quite some shoving on, however once it was on there, it has really made a difference in terms of being able to touch the handbrake when it's hot and things like that. Not necessarily something we're worrying about at this time of year, but yeah, definitely makes a little bit of a difference in that regard. Exterior wise, Peggy's got, most obviously, and the thing that I think people notice her for the most is the red and white wheels. It's a little bit Marmite. I've had people say that I should have kind of kept them all white and things, but I figured there's a lot of Trafalgar blue Morris Minors out there, so adding a little bit of flair to mine really wasn't going to be too much of a point of issue. And also it means that it's more noticeably mine when I go to shows and things like that, which I quite like. She stands out a little bit from the crowd. So that was something that I did myself about this time last year actually. Peggy had to come off the road because our driveway was being done, so it was something that I'd wanted to do from the minute I got her, but I was a little bit cautious. And when this opportunity came to basically have her off the road for a little bit and dry the paint really well, that's what I did. So really enjoyed having that kind of way of customising them a little bit, and I really like the way that they look in photos, and that it kind of ties in with the interior a little bit now as well. Another kind of difference that she's got on the outside is these wing mirrors. It's not the kind of traditional placement for a Morris Minor of the period. Usually they'd be literally on the wing, but those aren't particularly useful. I'm not saying these are. They have their issues, and also annoyingly they are placed in a way that makes it very difficult to open the quarter lights fully. You have to kind of open this window, manoeuvre the quarter light round the wing mirror. So it's not ideal, but they do kind of, this one particularly kind of works, especially as you're trying to pull onto a motorway or an A road or something, a dual carriageway where you've got to pull down a slip road. It has its benefits for sure, but yeah, they're there. They're a little bit annoying with the quarter lights, but they're useful enough, and I don't think I'll look at changing them really until Peggy needs a respray because of the kind of holes and stuff that have been put in the body to put them there. I mentioned kind of two of the stickers that are interior / exterior, Peggy's name and the SSR one that I put on outside Peggy, but I've also more recently added a little passenger seat podcast one, and a Morris Minor Young Members one. I was a bit kind of slow and unsure about if I wanted to put lots of stickers and stuff on the windows, so I'm just being selective and putting a few for the time being that I've spent a bit of time thinking about, but the little passenger seat podcast one seemed like a good idea, and I like how it looks next to the Morris Minor Young Members one. Also, one of the very first things we did was fit a locking fuel cap. She had just a normal kind of twist off one, so that was one of the very first things I remember kind of buying for the car, was a locking fuel cap, just so that being in daily use and things like that, I was never going to come to my car and find that all the fuel had been siphoned off too easily. So that was definitely a good decision in terms of that, and definitely something I'd recommend. It's very barely noticeable. I've kept her original fuel cap that was on the car safe in her kind of box of bits and bobs that she came with, much like the original steering wheel, kept that as well, but for my use, the Lockings fuel cap is an excellent accessory to have, especially if you're daily in the car. And that kind of leads us to our last kind of visible modification outside the car, and that's her exhaust. I've had a few people note that it looks a bit bigger than the usual Morris exhaust, and it certainly sounds it as well. And that's because it's not an original one, it is a bigger one. I don't know exactly what it is. I know that it drops very low below the car, so I have to be quite careful on speed bumps, but it looks like it's been on there for quite some while. I found a little while ago photos of her from about 2014 up on the internet on Flickr, and in those photos she's got this exhaust fitted and much of the modifications that we'll move on to in the engine bay. So I believe it was probably done with all of those at the same sort of time. When that was, it's difficult to place because I haven't really found it mentioned in the paperwork, so it might even predate the kind of very first bits of paperwork, which were 1993. So moving on to the mechanicals and the engine bay, that exhaust comes under the car and goes into the Howley manifold, and I'll be honest, I did not realise that that manifold was anything in particularly special, anything unusual, purely because I hadn't seen any other Morris Minor engine bays at the time when I bought her. And I'm not saying that it's particularly special, but it's got quite an interesting history, the Howley company, and it tends to be used on racing minis. So when we put that Howley manifold with the kind of bigger board exhaust, as well as the HS2, I think, carb that she's got in her, it seems that she was definitely being considered for doing a little bit more than a Morris Minor usually does, quite comfortably, and I can definitely feel that she does do that. She also has a air filter set up slightly differently. That's because based on those photos that I found on Flickr, she used to have a very different air filter fitted that wasn't very good, and then someone's gone back and kind of fitted one that looks a little bit more original, but looks a little bit different in position to some other people's ones, because of the exhaust and the manifolds and stuff like that sitting differently on that side. We've also got the 5-speed gearbox in Peggy, and I remember my dad kind of saying that actually it was quite a good modification to have, because it wasn't going to be that visible to anybody outside, as if I was going to be worried about originality 2 years down the line. But it's definitely a good modification for Peggy, in terms of me being able to do kind of pretty happy cruising speeds. I'm not sure how much it helps with kind of fuel economy and things like that, but it means that it's a little bit less noisy when we're at 60 plus, cruising on motorways and things like that on some of our longer journeys. And yeah, just acts a little bit, I guess, like an overdrive gearbox in that regard. So we've got all of these things to make Peggy a little bit nippier, a little bit more rapid, and thankfully when they were making all of these modifications, they also made the decision to fit a brake servo. She's still running on drum brakes all round, but we have got a little brake servo which works quite well. I haven't had any issues with her stopping, especially when other kind of drivers have done things that I haven't been able to predict. It's worked reasonably well in that regard, so I haven't had too much of a problem there. Now, a lot of these alterations are things that I've not made. They're ones that she kind of came with. In terms of the modifications mechanical wise that I've made, the only big changes that have happened you've heard about on the podcast, and that was the fitting of the alternator last year when the dynamo decided it had had enough and was very worn and things like that. And also the fitting of the 74 degrees thermostat. I haven't had the need to kind of change it back to like an 88 or whatever at winter, which I know some people do. But it's worked reasonably well for kind of what I need, and because she's kind of garaged and stuff in winter, again, not come across that issue there. So she's still running on the 74 degrees thermostat, and we still get reasonably warm in here off of that, so not really a big issue there. And the alternator is still working pretty well, and that's always reassuring that we've got some charge and things like that going back into the battery. Recently, when we went to the NEC in November, my dad found a snail shell horn, and having got one of those fitted to his A40 Farina, he's a big advocate of how kind of loud and in your face they are. So we fitted one of those to Peggy quite recently, and it really does have quite the impact when you press it. So from checking my notes, seems that that's pretty much everything for me to cover. If you've been watching on YouTube, I've hopefully had a chance to kind of film some footage and some walk around of some of this as well, so that you can see some of these slight differences in action for the very first time. And you've really enjoyed hearing about the kind of comprehensive list. I know that a lot of things have been mentioned individually throughout the running of the podcast, but the comprehensive list of kind of how Peggy is right now. So thank you very much for listening. Drive safely and happy motoring.